For a long time, people believed the world was dangerous, but manageable. Risks existed, but they felt contained. Threats had borders. Problems had explanations. If you worked hard, followed the rules, and stayed within familiar systems, life felt predictable enough. Then that belief quietly collapsed. There was no single sound, no clear announcement, no instant chaos. Daily life continued. People went to work. Cities stayed lit. Schedules remained intact. But beneath that surface, something fundamental shifted. A realization settled in that could not be undone. Safety was not a permanent condition. It was a temporary arrangement. This video is not about panic. It is about recognition. The recognition that systems could fail without warning. That distance no longer guaranteed protection. That progress did not eliminate risk. It only changed its shape. The future stopped feeling like a promise and started feeling like a question. People didn't say, "We are unsafe now." They said, "Things don't feel reliable anymore." And that feeling changed how people planned, trusted, worked, and imagined what tomorrow might bring. Not dramatically, quietly, permanently. As we move through this topic, you'll see how the illusion of safety formed, why it lasted as long as it did, and what happened psychologically when it finally broke. This isn't about fear. It's about the moment certainty disappeared and never fully returned. Before we continue, I'm curious, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Write it in the comments. Because one day, this exact moment will be remembered as before something else. If you enjoy calm, reflective history that explains how the world felt, not just what happened, like the video and subscribe. These stories reveal their meaning slowly, and the most important part always comes later. Now let's begin with the moment people realized safety was just an illusion. For a long time, people did not believe the world was completely safe, but they did believe it was predictable. Danger existed, yet it felt bounded. Problems appeared to have causes that could be identified, addressed, and eventually corrected. Systems were trusted not because they were perfect, but because they seemed reliable enough to manage uncertainty. Over time, this reliability hardened into expectation, and expectation quietly transformed into belief. Safety stopped feeling like something that had to be earned or protected and started feeling like something that simply existed in the background of daily life. This belief did not come from optimism. It came from repetition. When routines hold, when disruptions are rare, and when institutions respond before problems reach ordinary people, confidence grows. Roads function, supply continues, obligations remain predictable, and decisions feel meaningful because outcomes appear stable. Life feels navigable. People begin to plan not just days or seasons ahead, but years. Planning reinforces the sense that the future is knowable. A knowable future feels safe, even if danger has not disappeared. What people trusted was not the absence of risk, but the presence of buffers. There was a belief that between individuals and uncertainty stood layers of protection, procedures, coordination, authority, and time. If something went wrong, it would be handled somewhere else, by someone else, before it reached daily life. That distance created comfort. Comfort created complacency. Complacency allowed the idea of safety to settle in without being examined. The moment people realized safety was just an illusion did not arrive with shock. It arrived with inconsistency. Something that had always worked began to falter, not dramatically, but repeatedly. A delay that was once rare became common. An interruption that was once temporary returned again. Each instance alone seemed manageable. Together, they formed a pattern that resisted quick explanation. When systems fail briefly, trust holds. When they fail persistently, trust erodes quietly. At first, people explained the disruption away. They assumed it was mismanagement, timing, or coordination. These explanations preserved the belief that safety itself remained intact. The idea that safety was conditional rather than structural was uncomfortable, so it was postponed. People waited for correction. Waiting felt reasonable because correction had always come before. But as waiting extended, something subtle changed. Confidence no longer rested on certainty. It rested on hope. Hope feels different from safety. Hope requires attention. Safety does not. As disruptions overlapped, people began to notice how much of their daily life depended on systems they did not control. This realization was not abstract. It appeared in practical decisions. Plans became shorter. Commitments became more cautious. People stopped assuming continuity and started preparing for interruption. Preparation is a behavioral signal. It reveals belief before belief is spoken. This shift did not produce panic. Panic is loud and short-lived. What emerged instead was vigilance. Vigilance is quiet and durable. It does not demand action immediately, but it reshapes expectation permanently. Once vigilance sets in, people never fully relax back into assumption. Calm becomes something to monitor rather than something to trust. What collapsed was not safety itself, but the idea that safety was guaranteed. That distinction matters. The world did not suddenly become more dangerous. It became more visible. The distance between cause and effect narrowed. The buffers that once absorbed uncertainty began to transmit it. When problems reached ordinary life without being resolved upstream, the illusion dissolved. Illusions do not shatter loudly. They fade as evidence accumulates. Each small contradiction weakens belief until belief quietly reconfigures itself. People stop asking whether something is safe and start asking how stable it is and for how long. Stability replaces safety as the key concern. Stability is measurable, temporary, and conditional. Safety had felt permanent. This change in framing altered how people understood progress. Progress had once implied increasing security. When security became uncertain, progress lost its certainty as well. Advancement began to feel fragile rather than inevitable. Gains needed protection. Systems needed reinforcement. Growth slowed not because ambition disappeared, but because risk tolerance declined. Risk tolerance depends on confidence. Confidence depends on predictability. Predictability had weakened. The realization that safety was an illusion was not synchronized. Different people reached it at different times. Some noticed early because their position exposed them to fragility sooner. Others noticed late because their buffers held longer. But once recognized, the understanding spread indirectly through behavior rather than declaration. Conversations changed. Planning changed. Silence changed. Silence is important. When people stop speaking confidently about the future, it signals recalibration. Recalibration reshapes trust. Trust shifts from systems to strategies, from institutions to contingency. People diversify dependence. They avoid single points of failure. They hedge rather than commit fully. These adjustments accumulate. Accumulation reshapes culture. Culture reshapes institutions. Institutions reshape daily life. The change feeds back into itself until it feels normal. A new normal forms, one where uncertainty is assumed and safety is treated as situational rather than structural. This new normal does not eliminate hope, but it transforms it. Hope becomes cautious. It attaches conditions. It no longer assumes continuity. People imagine multiple futures rather than a single path forward. Branching futures complicate decision-making. Complication slows momentum. Slower momentum reduces exposure to risk, but also limits transformation. This trade-off becomes accepted gradually. People value resilience over efficiency, redundancy over speed, preservation over expansion. These values are not dramatic. They are practical responses to a world perceived as fragile. What makes this moment historically significant is how ordinary it felt while it was happening. There was no universal recognition, no shared announcement. People continued working, planning, and living. But underneath routine, expectations had shifted. Once shifted, they did not return. The illusion of safety did not vanish completely. It weakened. It became conditional. People still experienced moments of calm, but calm no longer implied permanence. Calm became provisional, something to be used carefully rather than enjoyed freely. This provisional mindset reshaped how societies moved forward. It introduced caution into innovation, restraint into expansion, and vigilance into everyday life. These traits are invisible in the moment, but powerful over time. They influence what is built, what is delayed, and what is abandoned. The moment people realized safety was just an illusion was not a single day. It was a cognitive turning point spread across experience and repetition. It mattered not because of what happened externally, but because of what changed internally. Once belief adjusted, the future was imagined differently. And once imagination changes, history changes with it. Once people accepted, even quietly, that safety was not guaranteed, their relationship with the world changed in subtle but lasting ways. They did not abandon routines, but they no longer trusted them blindly. The difference was small on the surface, yet enormous underneath. The same actions were performed, but with different expectations attached to them. Life continued, but it felt conditional rather than assured. One of the earliest shifts appeared in how people thought about responsibility. When safety had felt structural, responsibility was delegated. Systems were assumed to handle risk. Individuals focused on their roles within those systems rather than on the systems themselves. Once safety was understood as fragile, responsibility began to move back toward the individual. People paid closer attention. They double-checked. They prepared alternatives. This was not paranoia. It was recalibration. Recalibration changes behavior before it changes language. People began to notice dependencies they had previously ignored. Supply chains, coordination, timing, and cooperation were no longer abstract concepts. They became personal concerns. A delay mattered. A failure mattered. The realization was not that everything would collapse, but that collapse was possible. Possibility alone was enough to alter planning. Planning became shorter term and layered. Instead of a single assumed future, people began imagining multiple scenarios. This branching did not feel dramatic. It felt cautious. Long-term commitments were still made, but with exit strategies. Flexibility replaced confidence. Stability was no longer assumed. It was monitored. Monitoring consumes attention. As attention shifted toward uncertainty, trust changed form. Trust did not disappear, but it became conditional. Systems were trusted when they functioned, not because they existed. This conditional trust altered how authority was perceived. Authority was no longer seen as a shield against risk, but as one actor among many trying to manage it. Management replaced protection. Protection implies permanence. Management implies effort. Effort can fail. This understanding made people more tolerant of imperfection, but less forgiving of opacity. When safety was assumed, transparency mattered less. When safety became conditional, people wanted to know how decisions were made, how failures were handled, and how close systems were to their limits. Silence became unsettling. Delays without explanation increased anxiety. Anxiety does not always lead to panic. Often, it leads to restraint. Restraint appeared in consumption, movement, and ambition. People avoided overextension. They favored redundancy. They saved resources not for growth, but for interruption. This behavior slowed momentum. Momentum had once been a sign of progress. Now it felt risky. Risk perception reshapes values. Efficiency lost some of its appeal. Efficiency removes buffers. Buffers protect against failure. Once failure felt plausible, buffers became desirable again, even if they reduced speed or output. This shift was not ideological. It was practical. The illusion of safety had allowed people to believe that systems could be optimized endlessly. The loss of that illusion reminded them that optimization increases fragility. Fragility is tolerable only when safety is assumed. Once safety was no longer assumed, fragility became unacceptable. This realization also altered how people interpreted calm periods. Calm was no longer proof that systems were strong. It was simply a temporary state. People learned to treat calm as an opportunity to prepare rather than a signal to relax. Preparation replaced celebration. This mindset change had emotional consequences. Constant vigilance is tiring. People did not feel afraid all the time, but they felt alert more often. Alertness consumes energy. Over time, it reshaped priorities. People valued predictability in small things because large-scale certainty felt unavailable. Small stability became precious. Large certainty felt unrealistic. This recalibration also affected how people related to the future. The future was no longer imagined as a smooth continuation of the present. It was imagined as a space of potential disruption. This did not eliminate optimism, but it anchored it. Optimism became conditional on maintenance, coordination, and care. Care became central. Caring for systems, relationships, and resources gained importance. Neglect felt dangerous. Complacency felt irresponsible. People began to see maintenance as a form of progress, even if it produced nothing visibly new. This was a profound shift. Modern societies had often treated maintenance as secondary to innovation. Once safety felt illusory, maintenance moved to the foreground. Keeping things working became more valuable than pushing them further. Pushing introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty had already proven costly. Another subtle effect was how people understood failure. Failure no longer felt exceptional. It felt structural. This reduced shock but increased seriousness. People expected systems to fail occasionally and judged them by how they recovered rather than by whether they failed at all. Recovery became the metric of strength. Strength redefined itself. This new understanding did not lead to withdrawal from the world. People did not stop engaging. They engaged differently, with less assumption, with more contingency, with quieter expectations. Quiet expectations are durable. They do not demand constant reassurance. They accept limits. The moment safety was recognized as an illusion did not destroy social trust, but it reshaped it. Trust became layered. People trusted locally more than abstractly. They relied on what they could observe directly. Distance reduced confidence. This shift strengthened some bonds and weakened others. It made societies more cautious, but also more attentive. Attention can be exhausting, but it also prevents surprise. Surprise had become the enemy, not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed dependency too late. In the end, what changed most was not behavior itself, but interpretation. The same actions meant different things. Planning felt provisional. Stability felt earned. Safety felt temporary. Temporary does not mean absent. It means fragile. Once fragility is understood, it becomes part of how the world is perceived. That perception does not fade easily. It becomes a background awareness that shapes decisions quietly. This is why the illusion of safety, once lost, is rarely restored. People may feel safe again, but they do not believe in safety the same way. Belief requires innocence. Innocence does not return once dependency is seen clearly. The world did not become more dangerous at that moment. People simply stopped mistaking order for permanence. And that distinction changed everything. Once the illusion of safety faded, societies did not collapse or panic, but they began to reorganize themselves quietly around a new assumption. Continuity could no longer be taken for granted. This was not a sudden philosophical shift, but a practical one, rooted in daily observation. People noticed that systems no longer corrected themselves automatically, that delays accumulated, and that disruptions did not always resolve quickly. These observations changed how people evaluated risk, trust, and effort, even when outward behavior looked unchanged. One of the most significant adjustments occurred in how societies interpreted stability. Stability had once been seen as a natural state, something that existed unless disturbed by exceptional events. After the illusion weakened, stability was redefined as an outcome rather than a condition. It was something produced by constant work, coordination, and vigilance. This reframing mattered because it shifted attention away from abstract confidence and toward maintenance. Maintenance became visible in a way it never had before. Activities that once felt mundane, repairing systems, preserving routines, monitoring small failures, were reinterpreted as essential acts that kept larger breakdowns at bay. This new understanding altered how people related to institutions. Institutions were no longer viewed as permanent guardians of order, but as structures that required care and could fail if neglected. Respect for institutions did not disappear, but it became conditional. People trusted them when they functioned well and questioned them when they did not. This conditional trust did not always express itself through protest or open criticism. More often, it appeared as quiet hedging. People relied on institutions, but they also prepared alternatives. They avoided total dependence on any single system. Dependence itself became visible. Before, dependence had been masked by reliability. When systems worked consistently, reliance felt invisible. Once reliability faltered, dependence became obvious. People realized how much of their daily life rested on coordination beyond their control. This realization did not necessarily produce fear, but it produced humility. The world felt less solid, not because it had changed dramatically, but because assumptions had been revised. Revised assumptions reshaped planning. Long-term plans became more cautious. Instead of projecting forward with confidence, people began to plan in layers. Immediate needs were prioritized. Medium-term possibilities were considered carefully. Distant futures were treated as flexible rather than fixed. This layering was not pessimistic. It was adaptive. It allowed people to respond to uncertainty without being overwhelmed by it. Adaptation also changed how people interpreted progress. Progress had once been associated with expansion, speed, and efficiency. After safety was understood as fragile, progress became associated with durability, redundancy, and resilience. Systems that moved quickly but failed suddenly were viewed as risky. Systems that moved slowly but endured were valued more highly. This shift did not halt innovation, but it redirected it. Innovation focused less on pushing limits and more on strengthening foundations. Foundations became a recurring concern. People paid more attention to infrastructure, logistics, and coordination. These elements had always existed, but they had rarely occupied public imagination. They were taken for granted. Once safety was no longer assumed, foundations became objects of scrutiny. Weak points mattered. Single points of failure mattered. Invisible processes mattered. This attention to foundations also reshaped social behavior. People became more aware of interdependence. Individual actions were understood to have broader consequences. This did not always produce solidarity, but it did reduce illusion. No one imagined they were fully insulated anymore. Even those who felt relatively secure understood that their security was contingent. Contingency changed emotional tone. Confidence softened. Certainty narrowed. Optimism became cautious. None of this felt dramatic in daily life, but it altered long-term orientation. People valued predictability in small, controllable areas. Large promises felt unreliable. Trust migrated toward what could be observed directly. This migration affected community relationships. Local connections gained importance because they were visible and responsive. Distant systems felt abstract and slow. People leaned into what they could influence. This did not mean societies became isolated, but it did mean that trust was increasingly layered rather than uniform. Authority adapted as well. Leaders could no longer rely on the assumption that systems would shield people from uncertainty. Expectations shifted. Authority was judged less by its ability to promise safety and more by its ability to respond when safety failed. Responsiveness replaced reassurance as the primary measure of competence. Silence or delay damaged trust more than imperfection. This placed new pressure on decision-making. Decisions had to account for fragility. Overconfidence was penalized. Flexibility was rewarded. Policies and strategies that allowed adjustment were favored over rigid commitments. This did not eliminate mistakes, but it changed how mistakes were interpreted. Failure became less shocking and more instructive. Instruction reshaped norms. Societies learned to live with uncertainty rather than denying it. This learning was uneven and imperfect, but it accumulated. Over time, people became less surprised by disruption. Surprise did not vanish, but it lost its power to destabilize belief entirely. The world was no longer imagined as safe by default, so evidence to the contrary did not feel worldview-shattering. This adjustment also influenced how people related to time. The future was no longer seen as a smooth extension of the present. It was imagined as conditional, shaped by variables that required attention. This conditional view did not eliminate hope, but it reframed it. Hope became something that required care, coordination, and effort rather than something guaranteed by progress. Effort itself was revalued. Effort spent on preservation was no longer seen as wasted. Maintaining what existed became as important as creating something new. This shift had cultural implications. Maintenance, repair, and continuity gained recognition. Neglect became more visible and more costly. Over time, these changes created a quieter, more restrained social rhythm. Life continued, but with fewer assumptions and more checks. People learned to live with the idea that order was temporary and had to be renewed constantly. This renewal did not feel heroic. It felt routine. But routine renewal is precisely what replaced the old illusion. The illusion of safety had not been replaced by fear. It had been replaced by awareness. Awareness does not demand constant action, but it shapes readiness. Readiness became the new baseline. Instead of expecting protection, people expected responsibility. Instead of assuming stability, they assumed maintenance. This transformation did not occur everywhere at once, nor did it produce identical outcomes. Some groups adapted more quickly, some resisted longer, some benefited from the new emphasis on resilience. Others struggled with the loss of certainty. But across differences, the underlying assumption shifted in the same direction. Safety was no longer an inherited condition. It was a temporary state that required work. Work that is never finished changes how people see the world. It encourages humility. It discourages complacency. It slows reckless expansion. It rewards attention. These qualities do not produce dramatic historical moments, but they shape eras. By the time these adjustments were fully embedded, the illusion of safety was no longer missed. People did not long for it. They adapted to its absence. The world felt less predictable, but also more honest. Expectations aligned more closely with reality. This alignment reduced shock, even as it increased effort. In this sense, the loss of the safety illusion did not make societies weaker. It made them more realistic. Realism does not remove danger, but it clarifies it. Clarity allows preparation. Preparation allows endurance. Endurance replaced assumption as the core strategy. That replacement marked a quiet turning point in how people related to the future. The world did not suddenly become unsafe. It became understood. And once understood, it could no longer be imagined the old way again. As the understanding that safety was conditional settled more deeply, societies began to reorganize not only their plans, but their expectations of one another. The most important shift did not occur at the level of visible policy or public declaration. It occurred at the level of everyday judgment. People evaluated situations differently. They interpreted signals differently. They weighed risk and responsibility with a sharper awareness of fragility. This recalibration was subtle, but it changed how trust functioned across entire communities. Trust had once relied on consistency. When systems behaved predictably, trust followed automatically. Once predictability weakened, trust had to be rebuilt continuously. This did not eliminate cooperation, but it altered its tone. Cooperation became more deliberate. People asked not only whether something should be done, but whether it could be sustained. Short-term success mattered less than long-term viability. Actions were judged by their resilience rather than their immediate outcome. This change reshaped social contracts. Agreements that once assumed stable conditions now included implicit flexibility. People became more tolerant of adjustment, delay, and revision. Rigid commitments felt risky because they left no room for correction. This did not mean promises lost meaning. It meant promises were framed differently. They were understood as intentions subject to circumstance rather than guarantees immune to disruption. Circumstance gained prominence as an explanatory category. When safety had felt assured, disruption was often interpreted as failure. After the illusion faded, disruption was interpreted as information. It revealed stress points. It exposed dependencies. It showed where assumptions had been misplaced. This reframing reduced outrage but increased scrutiny. People became less shocked by breakdown and more interested in diagnosis. Diagnosis requires attention, and attention became a scarce resource. As vigilance increased, so did cognitive load. People could not monitor everything constantly. This forced prioritization. Some risks were accepted, others were mitigated. The act of choosing which risks to tolerate became a defining feature of decision-making. Safety was no longer binary. It existed on a spectrum, and people learned to live within that gradient. Living within a gradient changed emotional responses. Anxiety did not disappear, but it became more focused. Rather than fearing everything vaguely, people learned to identify specific vulnerabilities. This specificity allowed targeted preparation. Preparation reduced helplessness even when it did not eliminate risk. Feeling prepared mattered psychologically as much as actual protection. Preparedness also altered how people related to expertise. Expertise was valued less for certainty and more for adaptability. Those who acknowledged limits and adjusted quickly were trusted more than those who projected confidence without flexibility. Overconfidence became a liability. Humility became a strength. This inversion changed leadership expectations quietly but decisively. Leadership itself became more exposed. When safety was assumed, leaders could operate behind stable systems. When safety was conditional, leaders were evaluated by how they handled uncertainty openly. Transparency mattered more than authority. Explanation mattered more than reassurance. People wanted to understand how decisions were made because understanding reduced surprise. Reduced surprise preserved trust. This emphasis on explanation reshaped communication norms. Silence, once neutral, became suspicious. Lack of information created anxiety. Even imperfect information was preferable to none. This did not mean people demanded constant updates, but they expected acknowledgement of uncertainty. Pretending uncertainty did not exist undermined credibility. Credibility became fragile. It depended on alignment between words and outcomes. When outcomes diverged from assurances, belief adjusted quickly. People did not necessarily become cynical, but they became discerning. Discernment reduced blanket trust and increased selective reliance. Selective reliance influenced how people organized their lives. They diversified dependencies. Instead of relying on a single pathway, they sought alternatives. Redundancy became desirable even when it was inefficient. Inefficiency was tolerated because it provided insurance against interruption. This trade-off slowed growth but increased durability. Durability reshaped values. Speed lost prestige. Reliability gained it. The fastest solution was not always the best if it failed under stress. This revaluation affected everything from infrastructure to personal choices. People favored what lasted over what impressed. This shift also altered perceptions of success. Success was no longer measured solely by expansion or achievement. It was measured by continuity under pressure. Systems that endured modestly were seen as more successful than systems that achieved spectacular results briefly and then faltered. Endurance became an achievement in itself. Endurance required cooperation, and cooperation required trust calibrated to fragility. People became more attentive to how their actions affected others. Interdependence was no longer theoretical. It was experienced. This awareness did not automatically produce harmony, but it reduced illusion. No one imagined they were fully insulated from collective outcomes. This realization reshaped conflict as well. Disagreement did not disappear, but escalation felt riskier. When systems were perceived as fragile, destabilizing conflict carried higher perceived cost. People became more cautious about actions that could undermine shared stability. This did not eliminate tension, but it altered its expression. Expression moved from confrontation toward negotiation. Negotiation allowed adjustment. Adjustment preserved continuity. Continuity mattered more than winning. This pragmatic orientation was not idealistic. It was adaptive. Adaptation also influenced how people thought about time. Short-term disruption was no longer seen as aberration. It was expected. Long-term planning accounted for interruption. This did not produce pessimism so much as realism. The future was imagined as something that required ongoing attention rather than something that unfolded automatically. Attention became a form of labor. Maintaining awareness required effort. This effort was distributed unevenly. Some people carried more of the burden than others. This unevenness created new tensions. Those responsible for maintaining systems felt strain. Those less engaged sometimes underestimated fragility. These differences produced friction, but they also clarified roles. Role clarity became important. When safety was assumed, roles could be loosely defined. When safety was conditional, roles needed clarity to prevent gaps. Gaps were dangerous. They allowed problems to propagate unnoticed. Clarifying responsibility reduced that risk. This clarity also affected accountability. Accountability shifted from blame after failure to responsibility before failure. People valued foresight. Preventive action gained recognition even when it produced no visible result. Absence of disaster was understood as an outcome of effort rather than luck. Luck was reevaluated as well. When safety was assumed, good outcomes were attributed to normal functioning. After the illusion faded, good outcomes were recognized as contingent. This recognition increased appreciation for maintenance work that had once been invisible. Invisible work became visible. Maintenance, coordination, and preparation gained social recognition. Neglect lost its innocence. Ignoring warning signs was no longer neutral. It was seen as risky behavior. Risk behavior was redefined. It was no longer limited to dramatic actions. Inattention itself became risky. Overconfidence became risky. Failure to prepare became risky. This broadened definition reshaped norms quietly. Norms shape behavior over time. As these norms settled, societies became more cautious but also more capable of absorbing shock. Shock did not disappear, but it became less worldview shattering. People expected disruption. Expectations softened impact. Softened impact preserved functionality. Functionality preserved continuity. Continuity allowed learning. Learning improved adaptation. This cycle did not restore the illusion of safety. It replaced it with something more grounded. Grounded expectations reduced disappointment. They did not remove difficulty, but they reduced surprise. Surprise had been the most destabilizing element. Once surprise was anticipated, it lost some of its power. The illusion of safety had once promised freedom from vigilance. Its loss required ongoing effort. That effort became normalized. Normalization made it sustainable. Sustainable vigilance became part of daily life. This did not make life heavier in every respect. It made it more deliberate. People chose more carefully. They committed with awareness. They prepared for change. These behaviors did not attract attention, but they reshaped outcomes. Over time, societies adapted so thoroughly that the old illusion seemed naive. People did not long for it. They understood why it had existed and why it had faded. The world had not changed its nature. Understanding had changed. Understanding does not eliminate danger, but it reframes it. Once danger is framed accurately, responses become proportionate. Proportion reduces extremes. Extremes destabilize systems. Stability returned, but it was a different kind of stability. It was not based on assumption. It was based on effort. It required renewal. It could be lost. That knowledge did not paralyze society. It disciplined it. Discipline replaced innocence. This replacement marked the deeper transformation. The moment people realized safety was an illusion did not end progress or hope. It grounded them. It taught societies to live without guarantees and to build systems that acknowledged fragility rather than denying it. Once that lesson was learned, it did not need to be repeated loudly. It became embedded in behavior, expectation, and design. The world felt less certain, but also more honest. And in that honesty, societies found a quieter, more resilient way forward. The moment people realized safety was just an illusion did not end stability, but it permanently changed how stability was understood. What disappeared was not order itself, but the belief that order existed automatically. Safety was no longer seen as something guaranteed by systems or progress. It became something provisional, maintained through attention, cooperation, and constant effort. This realization reshaped societies quietly. People learned to plan with flexibility, to value maintenance as much as innovation, and to measure strength by recovery rather than perfection. Trust did not vanish, but it became conditional. Confidence softened into awareness. Calm periods were no longer mistaken for permanence, but used as opportunities to prepare. Living without the illusion of safety did not make the world darker. It made it clearer. Expectations aligned more closely with reality. Surprise lost its power to destabilize belief. Responsibility became visible, and care became central. Societies adapted not by retreating, but by grounding themselves in what could be sustained rather than what could be assumed. In the end, the loss of the illusion did not weaken people. It disciplined them. It taught them to live without guarantees, to build with fragility in mind, and to accept that continuity is always something that must be renewed. Safety was never permanent. Understanding that became the quiet turning point. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story helped you see the past and the present with clearer eyes, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments.